Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for coming tonight. On behalf of AgResearch, can I give you a very warm welcome to this evening's seminar entitled Capitalising on Clover. I don't need to tell any of you that agriculture is facing a period of challenge and change. In recent months, fertiliser prices have more than tripled and feed prices have more than doubled. Energy costs have also risen considerably. Agriculture is also under pressure to reduce its carbon footprint and improve water quality and biodiversity. In addition, the recent changes in the climate with increasing weather events is apparent for all of us to see. And this rather chaotic graph shows the growth of the grass check plots at Hillsborough and Greenmount over the last 6 years. One really has to ask the question, is there such thing as a normal grass year anymore? This evening's event is entitled Capitalising on Clover. Clover is currently an underappreciated and underutilised plant. Why is this the case? Most farmers have built up a dependence, some might say an addiction, on the use of manufactured fertiliser, and for very understandable reasons. For many years, manufactured fertiliser was freely available and offered a cheap and reliable and dependable way to grow grass. As a result, the clover management skills possessed by the previous generations have been lost. Despite repeated evidence that clover can grow good yields of high-quality forage, adoption remains low, and many farmers are convinced that they cannot grow clover on their farms. Indeed, our previous attempts to establish fertiliser on my own farm have largely come to naught. However, as is usually the case, this is the fault of the farmer and not the farm. Previous generations on my farm successfully grew clover for many years. Here is an invoice for grass seed bought by my great-grandfather in 1932. As you can see, it has a mixture of 4 grasses and 4 clovers, namely red clover, Alsike clover, wild white, also known as Kentish clover, and white clover. So why capitalise on clover? It has the potential to reduce costs. Red clover offers the potential to grow more protein at home. It will help improve soil health and biodiversity and lower your carbon footprint through lower emissions of N2O and improved carbon sequestration. Interest in clover is growing. In our recent Rising Costs Autumn Survey, over 60% of the farmers expressed an interest in establishing clover. In recognition of this appetite, AgResearch has organised this evening's webinar. We have 2 excellent speakers this evening who bring a wealth of knowledge on the subject, Dr. James Humphreys and Dr. Liz Jennifer. They will be joined at the panel discussion by Dr. David Patterson, grassland agronomist at AFBI Hillsborough, and we'll keep all questions until the panel discussion. So the first speaker is Dr. James Humphreys. James leads research at Chuggas's Solihead Dairy Research Farm. The soils on Solihead Farm are heavy and comparable to those found in much of Northern Ireland, and the research on the farm is focused on white and red clover. So my great appreciation to James. He's travelled 5 hours on a dark December day to travel up here, and it's with great pleasure that I invite him up here to give his talk.
Okay, thanks, Jason. This is a picture of the farm. There's a drain actually running here. The farm, we've got about 20 centimetres of topsoil and then a white marl. I don't know what you might call it up here. You know, this Dobby type soil, very, very heavy soil. And below that then we have a shallow water table, maybe about 2 metres deep. This anyway, just to get into the topic, which is developing a blueprint for low emissions dairy farming. And the challenge is, the target now for agriculture in Ireland is to lower greenhouse gas emissions by 25% by the end of the decade, which is an enormous challenge. So this shows greenhouse gas emissions in different European countries. And one that stands out here is Ireland. And you can see in 2 respects. One, we have very high emissions per person, very high emissions per capita. And the second thing is we have a very high proportion of those emissions coming from agriculture. And I guess the reason for that is we have a relatively low population density and a high reliance on agriculture. If we look at some of our neighbours, you can see United Kingdom has emissions substantially lower than Ireland, almost half. Denmark, 8.9, somewhat similar in terms of having a higher reliance on agriculture, similar sized country. And then Sweden, of course, the frugal Swedes with very low emissions. So I guess the pressure is on, dairy farming in particular in Ireland. If we look at the emissions there, it amounts to around 37% at the moment of emissions. If I was giving this presentation 10 years ago, emissions from agriculture would account for around 30%. And the reason for the increase is, one, dairy farm is expanding in the south, and I'll explain that later on. The second thing is, as we see reductions in emissions from other sectors of the economy, and we're seeing a slower rate of reduction from agriculture, obviously agriculture becomes a bigger proportion of our national emissions. And that's a real problem, because it places farming, dairy farming in particular, in the spotlight. And this is the latest EPA report this year. I was showing figures for last year, but dairy cow numbers up almost 3%, fertilizer use up 5%, that's in 2021. And both of those things contribute to greenhouse gas emissions. The fertilizer contributing to nitrous oxide, which is a very important greenhouse gas, and cow numbers increasing methane emissions. So that's the challenge. This is the background. This shows milk production since 1990, and obviously during the milk quota years there was stable milk production around 5 billion litres. I think we've recently exceeded 9 billion litres, so you're seeing very rapid expansion of milk production, and of course it's driven by income. If we look at income in dairy farms compared to beef, sheep and arable farms, you know, very good incomes, and this year, even with the very high cost of nitrogen fertilizer, it looked like incomes will be even higher. They're predicted to come out at around €130,000 for 2022. And if we compare that to the national average wage, we can say that dairy farming is a very tough lifestyle, milking cows, but it is comparing favourably in terms of wage. So I guess from a governmental point of view or a regulatory point of view, it's very hard to put a stop on what is a very successful business, but at the same time this climate targets need to be reached. This shows the number of dairy cows since 1975. And again, okay, so we had stable milk production during the 90s, early 2000s. During the 1990s and 2000s, we see a decline in cow numbers here. And that's because as cows became more efficient, producing more milk per cow, we needed less cows, so cow numbers declined. And of course, that gave us decreasing methane emissions during that period, up till around 2010. Since 2010, we had an easing of the milk quota, and we see dairy cow numbers increasing, and of course that's giving us increasing emissions. And the problem with that, of course, is our baseline is set back here in 1990, and now we're in a situation of increasing emissions. This shows nitrogen fertilizer use going back to 1955, and I guess the reason I go back that far is you know, when I was growing up, food security was the big question of the day, trying to feed a growing world population. I can remember a time when, you know, it was predicted that the world population would pass 4 billion people. How were we going to feed all of those people at that time? We've now passed 8 billion people, and of course, food security is less of an issue. May become an issue in the next few years, who knows, but certainly very changing environment. We had milk quota introduced in 1984, extensification introduced at the end of the 90s, and that brought about a reduction in fertilizer use. It's really this increase here that's causing concern. not only for greenhouse gas emissions, it's an important source, but also from the point of view of water quality. So during the 2000s, we had declining emissions, and now we've got increasing emissions. That's nitrous oxide coming off nitrogen fertilizer. So when we compare it to the baselines, we're seeing an increasing problem. And of course, we're all aware of the fact that this shows the price of calcium ammonium nitrate going back to 2011. Prices were reasonably stable, and then even prior to the war in the Ukraine there was an increase driven by shortage of gas, and of course since the war in the Ukraine has started, this huge increase. And of course we've been working on Clover as a means of lowering emissions, but huge amount of interest now that the price of fertilizer has gone through the roof. These are the challenges set out in the European Green Deal: reduce fertilizer use by 20%, and you might be aware that we've introduced a fertilizer register in the south, so all fertilizer being used has to be more tightly regulated than it had been in the past. And there are other things, other aspects of the Green Deal, increase in organic farming, things like that, that need to be reached. And all of those things, of course, will contribute to lower emissions. So in the terms of the work we've been doing, strong focus on managing white clover, and I've been working on that for the best part of 20 years, more than 20 years. And within that then, looking at the environmental impact, nitrogen carbon cycling, the impact of nitrate leaching, greenhouse gas emissions, and ammonia, which is the focus of what I'm going to talk about now. And we're also looking at soil carbon storage. Because if we think about lowering emissions from dairy farms, there's kind of two approaches we could take, and really the environmentalists, or a lot of the, these focus groups would tend to look at this approach, developing more extensive dairy systems, which of course lower stocking density, which will give us lower emissions obviously, but it mightn't be the best use of our resources in terms of how we use our land, our return on land on capital invested, and also if we have lower stocking rates, it generally tends to give us higher emissions per unit of product. So we can have lower emissions per hectare but higher emissions per unit of product, and of course that becomes important then when you're exporting what you produce, and we of course export 90% of what we produce in the south. And if companies are looking for milk with lower carbon footprint, that's working against it. The alternative then is to look at intensification, or look at it sustainable intensification and offsetting. And what I'm talking about here, and if you take into account we are dealing with pasture-based systems, there's only so far you can expect a cow to walk. To concentrate your dairying around the dairy farm, and then use land saved for offsetting, whether forestry or energy use. And as I said, we have declining emissions from other sectors of the economy, particularly energy generation, with growing wind resources. And I guess the answer, the solution to these questions probably lies somewhere in between these two alternatives, because we see the government bringing in increasing restrictions on stocking rates on farms, and they've recently, as you may know or may not know, but huge payments now for forestry, very, very substantial payments. This shows your typical greenhouse gas emissions on an intensive dairy farm. A study we've just completed. Stocking rate 2.42 livestock units per hectare, fertilizer use 270 kilos of nitrogen per hectare, which is high by international standards. We use a lot of nitrogen fertilizer because of the grass-based system. Coming in with a carbon footprint of around 1.2. And the breakdown then in the emissions you can see here, more than half of the emissions are methane from ruminant digestion. We also have greenhouse gas emissions from the manure. And that line was actually on the line, but if we divide those emissions into livestock emissions, the methane and the excreta, accounting for around 2/3 of the emissions. What we're focusing on is cutting emissions on the other side of that line, the particularly on fertiliser use. The idea is how far can we lower emissions without having to lower livestock numbers? Because ultimately we need cows to produce milk, and we need replacement heifers to maintain the herd. So how do we go about doing that? So this is the objectives that we set out. Lower greenhouse gas emissions from dairy farm, and then see what impact that has on production, because obviously we want to maintain production. We've invested a lot in infrastructure in the south in terms of processing capacity, and what impact it has on profitability, which is obviously important to the family producing the milk. And again, it's using off-the-shelf technologies, readily available technologies. For example, people talk about methane inhibitors and these type of products, which are not readily available. So the practices we put in place using red and white clover, protected urea, low emission slurry spreading, and high generic merit cows, as dictated by the Economic Breeding Index, the EBI. So that's pretty simple and straightforward. There's nothing complicated in what I'm talking about there. These are the three systems that we've been comparing over the last 5 years. 27 cows per system, so it's a large-scale experiment. This FN27, a high nitrogen system, 270 kilos nitrogen per hectare, using urea in can, urea in the spring and then can from May onwards. Low clover contents because we have a high nitrogen fertilizer input. Splash plate slurry application, EBI, that was the average for the herd last year. So this is your kind of Moore Park blueprint. Been around for a long time. High nitrogen system, can and urea. Then the second system, it's a Clover-based system, but using less nitrogen fertilizer. That nitrogen fertilizer is going on only in the spring, February, March, April, and also for first cut silage, and then no more fertilizer is used from April onwards. We've been running both of these systems for 20 years, but for the last 5 years now we're running this one only with protected urea as a way of lowering nitrous oxide emissions. Because we're using a lot less fertilizer nitrogen, we have higher clover content, trailing shoe slurry application, EBI of 165. And then this third system, which is really where we'd say the testing system, which is using no nitrogen fertilizer at all. Much higher clover content, trailing shoe slurry application, and in this case, we also put the highest EBI cows. So for example, if we're dividing the herd in the spring, first lactation cows to calf, then one of those three with the highest EBI went on to the high EBI herd. Likewise for the second, 3 cows to calf, third, fourth. So the herds that we have are balanced for both lactation number and for calving date. So that's the setup, and the idea was to test these different aspects of these systems to see to what extent they give us lower emissions. This is what it looks like. You can see the kind of swards we're dealing with, type of cows, black and white EBI cows. There's a strain of Jersey running through them and also some Norwegian red. This is our milk production, different systems. You can see the stocking rates there, fertilizer use, EBI. Not a massive difference in milk or milk solids production, not as much as we would have expected on the basis of the difference in EBI, and the average concentrate fed there was 550. This is our pasture production. Over those years, 15.7 tonnes under high nitrogen, 15.2 here with the Clover-based system with nitrogen fertilizer. And the big surprise is that the zero nitrogen system produced almost as much grass, more or less the same amount of grass as the pasture as the Clover system getting nitrogen. Essentially, the more nitrogen fertilizer we put on, the less we fixed. The less nitrogen fertilizer we put on, the more we fixed. So it's more or less a one-for-one trade-off, which is very surprising. But like we have a lot of data built up on this now over the last few years, and it seems to be performing year on year. So we're getting confidence in it now. You know, you could run the thing maybe for a few years, but 5 years of data, you get confidence. So anyway, we modeled this up to a 50-hectare farm. The farm in Solihull is around 50 hectares. Based on the average production, these are the stocking rates that we came up with. That's the amount of cows we can feed per hectare. Concentrate fed is the same as during the study. And then this shows us, based on those three systems, we end up with 128, 124, 123 cows on the farm. The heifers on the farm are contract reared, so we're working on that assumption here as well. And this shows our greenhouse gas emissions per litre of milk. Now I showed the number at the beginning of 1.2 litres or 1.2 kilos per litre on a typical intensive dairy farm. Our intensive system here, high nitrogen system, still came out quite well at 0.88. That's low by international standards. And then you can see the reduction here with the different systems. That shows the reduction per litre of milk. It is possible to lower emissions per litre of milk, as I was saying already, without necessarily lowering emissions per hectare. But in this case, we have equivalent reductions in emissions per hectare, going down to 9.3 tonnes per hectare. And this is the equivalent of a 16% reduction here in the first step, 25% reduction going down to zero. A substantial reduction, which is in line with the national target for reducing emissions from agriculture. Ammonia wasn't a major focus of our work, but because of the practice we've in place, we also lower ammonia emissions, and there are national targets for lowering ammonia. The reductions in ammonia emissions are even greater than the emissions or reduction in emissions we're seeing from in terms of greenhouse gases. So that's all very positive. The key question then, of course, is what impact does it have on profitability? And this shows the net margins per hectare. Now, as I said, we have run the first two systems here in the past using straight urea instead of protected urea. We published the results of that in 2012, both the economics and the impact on carbon footprint. And the results that time showed there was very little difference in profitability. And of course, at the time, if you have a fertilizer-based system, it's just as profitable as a clover-based system. Why would you switch to a clover-based system? Now, of course, there's a lot more pressure, both in terms of restricted nitrogen fertilizer use, and of course, this pressure coming in terms of greenhouse gas emissions. So there's a stronger incentive to change, and we're seeing a lot of interest in this out on farms. The big surprise is that this system came in more profitable, and that's really because we can maintain output with much lower inputs. This shows the numbers for I'll just go into that in more detail. This shows, just go into it in more detail. The prices used in this study are the average prices on the farm between 2019 and 2021. So it's during the last 3 years. It doesn't include the prices from this year, which are very different. So that's our total sales. Higher sales here, where we have a higher output system, higher input system. The impact of the EBI becomes clear here, particularly in terms of milk sales, where we produce higher value milk with less cows. It was marginal enough, it wasn't huge. The big difference, of course, in this study is the expenditure on nitrogen fertilizer, going from around 13,000 down to zero. If we put in the same figures for this year, for 2022, you're talking about a difference of going from 35,000 down to zero. So a big difference, obviously, this year. There are variable costs which largely reflect the differences in nitrogen fertilizer cost, and then our fixed costs. Now, within the fixed costs, we've included a full labour cost at 27 hours per cow with €15 per hour. So that works out around €50,000 across the different systems. So there's a full labour cost in there. So when we look at the net margin, that's a profit number. It's not a family farm income. As I showed in the original slide, if you wanted to look at this in terms of family farm income off a 50 hectare farm, you'd add back in the 50,000 labour cost. Just because people have different ways of looking at profitability. And that gives us our bottom line, and as I said, this system here, not only did it give us a substantial reduction in carbon footprint, it also gave us a more profitable system. So the conclusions to that is we've lower emissions with higher net margins using existing technologies. It's a very positive story that we can do this with a higher net margin. And the big driver of this, of course, was Clover. Taking out fertilizer nitrogen out of the system. If we look at the other aspects, EBI, low emission slurry spreading and protected urea, they all had relatively small impacts, 1 or 2%. The big percentage reduction was coming here from fertilizer nitrogen, and also the fact we had lower stocking rates. And what I'm talking about here is going from 128 cows down to 123, so we have less methane associated with lower cow numbers, and also less replacement heifers. And really it is the two of those two aspects, which are both related to Clover. If you think about it, we can have a lower stock system, lower output to some extent, but more profitable because we're spending less. It's as simple as that. The challenge then is to get these technologies adopted on farms, and we have been working with a group of farms over the last couple of years, and I meet him in the morning. And again, what we're doing in Salahead, we're replicating out on farms. So it's very reassuring from my point of view, because you work on a research farm, you know, you have everything optimized. When you can see the same type of results out on farms, it is very reassuring. And of course, you say, or as Jason was saying earlier on, there's a lot that we've forgotten when it comes to managing Clover. There's also an awful lot that we have to learn. I have a few slides on that if I have time. Okay. So just to give some of our thinking on managing Clover, because it does require a change in management. And the biggest change in management and the biggest obstacle to overcome is persuading people to stop applying nitrogen fertilizer, because it's an absolutely endemic part of what we do. So a lot of people could look at you askance when you say to them, okay, if you really want to get this working, you have to stop applying nitrogen fertilizer. But this is if we look at the clover yield, we want to drive up clover yield, and our target is to get up to around 5 tonnes of clover. So if we talk about growing 15 tonnes of pasture dry matter per hectare per year, we want 1/3 of that to be clover. We want 5 tonnes of clover, because we want to push up fixation up into this region here, 200 to 250 kilos nitrogen per hectare, which is in line with the maximum rates we're allowed to apply in the south now. So if you can take out the fertilizer with fixation, you know, that's what you need to drive the system, because ultimately farmers want to maintain output. They don't want to lose production, certainly don't want to lose profit. And this is what it looks like. This is our total annual yield. This is our clover yield. So how do we bring that about? We see reseeding as the first step. So we put in a reseed. Post-emergence herbicide is absolutely vital as a way of learning. This is the kind of mixes that we're using. So we're talking about on a per hectare basis. I don't know, is it per acre pack or per hectare you work off? Yeah, so this is 8 kilos per acre, 8 kilos in an acre pack, 8 to 10 kilos of ryegrass. I picked Aston Energy here. It's popular with farmers because it's a variety that you can really graze out well. You can skin it out to a low base, which is important for clover. We did a study a few years ago, it's nearly 20 years now, I say a few years, but with herds of cows similar to what I'm talking about there, we grazed to 6, 5 and 4 centimetres right throughout 3 years. By grazing to 4 centimetres, we increased production by 15% with no increase in inputs. And if you look at Aston Energy as a variety, it's a 5-star variety in terms of graze out, in terms of utilisation. And if you have a grass variety that you can really skin out to the butt, so to speak, that'll work well with clover. You need plenty of light down to the base of the sward with clover. We put in 2 kilos of red clover. Now Milvis is a very old variety, but we find that it lasts very well. We don't really have that on other varieties to the same extent. But when I was in college 30 years ago, we were told that red clover doesn't persist under grazing. We have Milvis now in swards, 5 years, still persisting very well. I think that's down to as well how we're managing potassium on the farm, P and K on the farm, potassium in particular. And then we put in 1 kilo of white clover, Bar Blanca, 2 kilos of white clover. We normally put in a mix of varieties. And just bearing in mind that red clover, you have 2.5 million seeds. And here so it's a 3-to-1 ratio of white clover to red clover in terms of seed numbers. So it's still a white clover dominated sward. And people ask me questions about multi-species and that type of thing. Our focus is entirely on managing white clover, and if the red clover can fit in there, that's fine. Generally what we'll find, this is showing 5-week-old seedlings, 6-week-old seedlings. We'll find fixation really kicks in after 6 weeks. So if you were thinking about trying this out at home, next April, put in a reseed, put in that type of seed mixture, maybe put on Tintin 20 for the first round just to get the crop established. Make sure to use a Clover Safe post-emergence herbicide, and then stop with nitrogen fertilizer. And that's what I've been saying to our own farmers, and that's the biggest challenge, is to stop. And this shows the impact of nitrogen fertilizer on clover yield, and it's well known, the more nitrogen fertilizer you put on, the less clover you'll yield. Fertilizer nitrogen drives out the clover. And people say to me about using this mid-rate of clover, of nitrogen, which we've done. And I asked one farmer why he was doing it, trying to persuade him, of course, to stop. And he said, well, I thought the nitrogen would help the clover along, but the reality is the nitrogen works against the clover. So on that basis, this is our 5 tons of clover that we're aiming for. We're getting around 4.2 at the moment. That's our average. We have some fields doing 5, but we need to work towards that. This shows our total yield in for the year on this axis, growing around 15-16 tons as we push up with nitrogen fertilizer use. On clover-rich swards, that purple line is on clover-rich swards. This is where we've no clover in the swards, just grass swards. So 2 very different response curves. And as I said, the difference here is all down to nitrogen fixation. So the more nitrogen we put on, the less clover we have, the less fixation we'll get. The less nitrogen we put on, obviously the opposite. So that's what drives the system. So as I said, low nitrogen fertilizer input, tight grazing, absolutely skinning out the swards. Soil pH needs to be right. Fixation is a biological process. And if you're down at a pH of 5.5, you're not going to get the level of fixation that you need. So we're talking about pushing up above 6.5. Regular applications of K and P, and K in particular. So we'll routinely go on with potassium around 15 units per round 4 times a year. We see that as important to put it onto the surface of the soil. When you look at white clover, it's very shallow rooted. So regular applications of K in particular. We stretch out the rotations from around the 1st of August. We'll run on a 3-week rotation, roughly speaking, prior to 1st of August. From then onwards, we build up cover on the farm until the middle of September. So we start out with a 3-week rotation in 1st of August, working up to around a 5-week rotation. Rarely hit 6 weeks by the middle of September. We'll double the amount of grass on the farm at that stage as a way of feeding that out then as we go into the end of September, October. It's a bit of a tough job this year with the very wet weather conditions we got during October. And the work we're doing at the moment, and we've some work on this already published, is that low winter covers. It's based on actually some work that Scott Laidlaw did up here back in the 80s. Low winter covers over the winter, very important. Skinning out the swards, even though that would be against our normal recommendations. So leaving plenty of light down to the clover stolon, white clover stolon over the winter. It favours survival. Like what we'll find is we lose around 50% of our stolon over the winter. If you had bad conditions, you could lose 80%. Of course, that puts you in a very bad position then in the following spring. So we're looking at these low winter covers, and then if we can maintain more of our stolon over the winter, we start with a much stronger position then in the spring. We see reseeding as important. Put in the type of mix I talked about, drainage and wet soils. Like the worst year for us in recent years was 2012. Remember, a very wet year for us, a lot of surface water. Like when you're relying on fixation, you're relying on air to get down into the soil so that the bacteria in the nodules on the roots of the clover can fix nitrogen. If the soil is waterlogged throughout the summer, that's very negative. So we've been doing a fair amount of drainage to counteract that. And then there's some other things you can do around silage management, but I think I've spoken for long enough now. So just the final comments. People often say to me, Clover system, it's a very difficult system, much more difficult to manage. If I look at grassland management 30 years ago or 20 years ago, it's changed enormously in the last 20 years. And this is just another adaptation. It's something else we have to work towards. It's not really more complicated, it's just different. You have to work to a new set of rules. We need to maximize the clover production. And that brings up questions then about bloat. And bloat is a major obstacle, and if you want something that will put people off growing clover, it's bloat. Again, that's something that needs to be managed. Need to set up the farm for grazing to low residuals. Part of this low winter cover is the fact that we start then in the spring with low covers, graze them out really well as you work your way through the spring, not allowing the residuals to build up. That really suits the clover. Also, the choice of cultivar, as I said, we're looking for these cultivars with good utilization characteristics, low covers over the winter. And as I said, it can lower our emissions and give us a profitable system. So I guess I'll hand over.
Thank you very much, James. A very interesting talk and a lot of food for thought for all the farmers in the audience and dairy farmers in particular. Our second speaker is Dr. Liz Jennifer. Liz, who will be no stranger to many of you, is an independent beef and sheep consultant from England, specialising in breeding and grass and forage management. Liz was senior beef and sheep scientist at HDB for 13 years before moving into private practice. She's one of the founders of Carbon Calling, a movement to connect livestock farmers with regenerative approaches to their land stock and themselves. She's been a trustee of the British Grassland Society, a committee member of the Sheep Veterinary Society, and is a director of Pasture for Life. And I have great pleasure of working with Liz for many years, and it's my great pleasure to invite her to speak to you.
Good evening, everybody. So, quick show of hands. Who's already growing white clover? Reasonable. How many about red clover? Oh, okay. So, and now we've heard from James. How many people want to improve their level of clovers? Oh, okay, excellent. So, I am going to hopefully. There we go. Take you through these sort of points. So why should we be interested? And again, there's a lot of engagement already in terms of legumes and particularly clovers. And I'm going to take you through other options. So we'll mainly focus on white and red clover, but other legumes that are being used within beef and sheep systems. Some more applicable than others, but just thought it would be useful just to go through some of them. And then options or how I'm seeing them being used in beef and sheep systems. And again, will be very similar to how you're using them here too, but just some ideas of how we're using them in certain places. So just to go back a step in terms of what is a legume, I love a definition. So the bits that the ones we're interested in is the one in bold, and we use them quite a lot within ruminant sectors. Soybean obviously is in there as well, and we buy some of that in. And as sort of talked about, what makes them a legume is this symbiotic relationship, this connection with bacteria within the soil that allows them to fix nitrogen from the air. So basically, as James said, it's the air that moves into the soil that those bacteria take the nitrogen out of, and it's part of an exchange process. So they give the plant nitrogen, and the plant gives them food. But as alluded to, when nitrogen is limited, they need to do the job. When they've got good air supply, they'll do the job, and they need decent nutrients. And molybdenum is quite important for that bacteria as well. And so certain soils, not many, but we also just have to look at the molybdenum levels too. So why should we be interested? We've heard very much about nitrogen fixation. from a beef and sheep production, and we've heard from a dairy systems, we're generally looking at between a 10 to 15% increase in live weight gains when we have high levels of clover within those animals' diets. And that's generally works for grazing and probably not as dramatic for silage, but has a similar impact. Where we've got legumes, we generally have improved animal performance. How that happens is that the legumes are more readily digested in the rumen. They move through the rumen quicker, they can eat more. So it's driving feed intake, as well as protein levels and energy, but it's more driven by feed intake. High protein levels in silage, so we're generally, in a red clover ryegrass-based silage, we're generally looking at 2 to 3% higher in crude protein than a standard grass. Some of those can go higher. So again, it's providing opportunities for people to buy in less protein and producing more on farm. I'm working with flocks now that are taking twin-bearing ewes, albeit in good conditions and in a house system, all the way through to lambing on red clover silage alone. So we can manage without any supplementation going into those diets. Certainly for triplets, we might need to put some additional protein in later on. In terms of sequestration, so clover-based swards sequester about 50% more carbon. So some figures coming from Natural England say within a grassland system, it might sequester 0.6 of a tonne a year. Within a red clover system, we're looking at 0.9. None of them are very dramatic, but again, we're showing this improvement of having clovers in terms of sequestering more carbon into soils. And how that happens is it's basically carbohydrates that are being moved from the plant, so sugars are being generated from the photosynthesis, they're being moved into the root, and they're leaking out into the soils, and that's where quite a lot of that carbon comes from. Different growth patterns that we'll talk about in a second. Improved soil structure, so both red and white clover will have good benefits in terms of improving soil structure. We've got to obviously have it good enough to get them to be well-established swards, but they will improve soil structure through how they root. We've briefly talked about diverse mixes, and they are a core part of doing multi-species swards and other things coming onto farm at the moment. More drought tolerant. I come from a bit of the world where we were brown from June, July, August and into September. And on some farms, white and red clover lasted until sometime in August. So they're not completely drought resilient or resistant, but they are more tolerant than grass alone. And that certainly in the dry year of 2018 has encouraged people to look at clovers more. And why they're more drought tolerant is that water use efficiency is very driven by nitrogen, and when you've got a plant which has its nitrogen being produced right by its roots, it helps in terms of improving its ability to use whatever moisture is available. Benefits the following crop. A key part of any arable or organic arable rotation, an old school arable rotation, but coming back, and particularly red clover being used by quite a lot of conventional farmers to boost soil structure and also nitrogen use. And animals do like it. So there's been some work in terms of putting one field of grass and one field of white clover and sort of understanding where the animals wish to spend time, and they do have preferences in terms of time of day of where they want to spend some time in white clover. So they do, I'm not advocating you set up that experiment on your farm, but certainly they like it. So when we look at the different types of clovers we've got available, so there's a big cluster here, and some of you may have already grown some of this. These are generally annual, well, they're all annuals. There's additional ones in relation to the ones I put on the screen. So we've got crimson, Balasar, Persian, yellow trefoil, and berseem or Egyptian clover. There's being sown a bit in cover crops, so some sheep farmers are accessing them through grazing off cover crops. Some seed companies are putting them into seed mixes to sort of boost the production the first year. Because of the annual, they don't tend to stay around very long, but can add certain benefits in that year one. Sweet clovers, alsatice, which looks like that picture that's come up, so it's quite a pretty flower. Subterranean is another annual that if you read a lot of work coming out of New Zealand and Australia, they talk a lot about subterranean clover. It drives quite a lot of their systems It's an annual that sets seed, so it's quite useful. We just don't grow very much of it here at the moment. Bird's foot trefoil looks like that. Incredibly, it was one of the sort of plants alongside ragwort, fat hen, bird's foot trefoil. They were very successful plants in the dry of 2022 in my bit of the world. The challenge is that not many things like eating it, and it doesn't tend to persist when they choose to eat it. So it's useful, but not going to really drive production systems. Vetches are quite interesting. So again, an annual can be used, and I'll go through a couple of examples of how they can be used, and can be quite important in whole crop situations as well. Red clover, I'll go into a bit more detail. Lucerne, I have a slight love affair with lucerne. Sainfoin, less so, and particularly like white clover. So we'll go through some of them in a bit more detail. But you can see from a legume perspective, or clover more, or legumes as we include lucerne and sainfoin, we have a huge variety of things we can use. It's just working out what's the best one to use and whether it's going to fit our system and our requirements. So I'm just going to take you through some of the ones, or the more interesting ones I've just talked through. So vetch looks like that. So quite a pretty purple flower with a particular leaf arrangement. As I said, annual. A lot of people are using it in maybe a cover crop, or sort of alongside oats, and grazing it off over the winter with the hope that generally it regrows into the spring. So quite a useful plant. It does fix quite a bit of nitrogen, but obviously is only there for that year really, and then has to be replaced. As mentioned, it can be used quite well alongside a cereal for a whole crop as well, so it's supplying nitrogen into that whole crop, so it's like a bicrop, so again, can be quite useful if that fits into your system. Red clover, not as versatile as white clover, but could be used significantly more than it is on a lot of beef and sheep systems. We'll talk a bit in a minute about one of the fear factors attached to it is an impact on topping. So the advice was always not to put sheep on it any 6 weeks either side of topping, and that's prevented quite a lot of people putting it in. There's been a very sort of quick demonstration project that's happened last year to sort of suggest that at low levels we don't seem to have that impact on sheep fertility, so it's sort of helping people put it into more places really. As also mentioned, bloat is a big risk when we start to graze this. So yeah, transition, just like transition onto any crop or different crop, we need to take care, monitoring animals regularly. But yeah, it can be grazed, and some farms are as a grass red clover lay, or as within a diverse lay. Lucerne. So I'm just the project. I was involved in a project where we were grazing it with sheep. So the sheep were lambing on it. They were on it, pre-lambing, lambed on it, and went all the way through to weaning in a very dry bit in the top end of Norfolk. But it is amazing when it is very, very dry how it keeps going. It will eventually start to fail, but it's green where everything else isn't for probably a good 6 weeks. It isn't necessarily applicable to all soil types, and certainly might not be the crop of choice in Northern Ireland with your heavy rainfall, but in terms of there might be soils where it is appropriate for use, and it likes high pH soils and it likes freely drained soils. Do not put it anywhere near any drained as in it's got drains in it, because the roots find the drains and just run down them and end up breaking your drainage system. So not ideal. The other thing from an animal perspective, the plant doesn't hold any salt in the leaves. It holds all of its salt in its roots. So you have to have salt and fibre available at all times. So it's a bit of a more tricky one from a grazing perspective, but on certain sites it is amazing in terms of what it can do. Sainfoin, again, interesting. Quite a lot of it grown on the Cotswolds. Quite a lot of European. There's been a recent European project using it. I really struggle with it because it's not very persistent, so it doesn't last as long as lucerne, but again, and doesn't like heavy or acidic land. So these two really not like pHs 6.5, 7-ish. So again, only applicable on certain areas, but still can fix a lot of nitrogen. The infamous and very versatile white clover. We've talked a bit about that, and there's quite a lot on this slide, but in terms of what is the different plants and sort of how they can be used and what are the considerations. So we've talked through white clover, red clover, a bit about annuals, this sort of mention of subterranean, so something that could be of interest, and where that might fit in the UK is more as an understory in arable systems, so using it to sort of provide some nitrogen to that growing arable crop. And mentioned at the bottom, so how we can grow beans, peas or vetches as a by-crop silage, so again reducing the amount of bought-in protein that we need onto farm. And a lot of people are using those sort of by-crops as an alternative to maize in marginal land. But again, it has to fit within your rotation, and some of them can be quite challenging to ensile and then feed out. Rats particularly like it. So some of these have been talked about, but I'll just go through them quickly in terms of what do we need to think about when we're establishing. And a lot of this is more, I'm really focusing back onto white and red clover really. So soil test, it's like any reseeding program or when you're trying to introduce new seeds into soils, we've got to think prep. So prior to that, we might have a bag in the shed and we might just whack it in, but ideally we need to do some soil tests in advance. We need to look at structure. We need to deal with any nutrients it requires. So we need to do some preparation before we get going, and the same is said for all reseeds, and with the other challenge of weed control. So there aren't many clover safe products out there, so whatever we need to do is to try and control weeds prior to that, accept them or deal with them with spot spraying, or a suggestion is to put, if you've got a particularly weedy field, put the grass in, deal with any weeds that emerge and then oversow the clover in. Sometimes the oversowing the clover is forgotten about, but that's an option if you've got a particularly weedy area. Overseeding is very possible, particularly with white clover, less successful with red clover, and again looking at between 1.5 and 2.5 kilos of white clover per acre, and we have to be careful in terms of how we manage the established grass, in terms of maybe running sheep across it every few weeks just to get them to take it down while the white clover is getting going. As mentioned, we definitely need a very good seed bed, but we also need very shallow. It needs to be scratched. As soon as it goes any deeper than that, you have the risk of losing some of those plants, or those plants never emerge. And less relevant for white clover, but for lucerne we have to have inoculated seed. So the bacteria that live in those nodules don't always exist in our soils for lucerne. And I'm dealing with some farms where they're putting clovers into arable fields that haven't had clovers for a while, and so we are inoculating some white clover seeds as well, just to make sure they get going with that particular bacteria they need. This is sort of supports what James said in terms of pH. So this is some old work in terms of, so soil pH is running along the bottom, so running 3 to 7, and you've got maximum dry matter yield up the top. So you can see for grass, grass is in the green line and clover is in the blue line. So there is this sort of benefit of higher pH for both of those types of plants, which is, we know quite well. This is also in terms of, there's a bit of question about if we are putting white clover into a reseed, do we need to put some nitrogen in to kickstart it? And this is some recommendations, which is not really is the answer, or no. In terms of no real recommendation for any nitrogen going into the seed bed for a white clover sward or base sward. And this is based on RB209, the section 3, which you can see at the bottom right. So in terms of, and we also have to sort of start to be honest with ourselves in terms of what does a good white clover sward look like. So the one nearest me is about 10% white clover, the middle one is 30%, and the one at the far end is 60%. So we've talked a lot about it fixing, white clover fixing 150 kilos plus. It does that when it's at 30% plus. If you've got a scattering of white clover in fields, it's not going to be fixing that amount of nitrogen. So we have, and what tends to happen is in certain systems, the clover might look like this 10% one in early spring. It hasn't really got going yet. The soils aren't warm enough. It's not moving quite as much as the grass. Come Late spring, it probably looks like 30%. Come the middle of summer, it will look like the 60%. So it will vary across the year in terms of what that clover's doing. But that's the sort of level we're talking about when we say clover swards. It's not just a scattering. It is, when you look down, it looks dominated by clover. However, if it looks like that's the furthest picture in the beginning of April, I would be worried there isn't enough grass, and grass is driving quite a lot of the yield. So we just also need to think about just assessing how much is there and adjusting our views in terms of how much nitrogen is being fixed. The image on the bottom left is what a white clover plant looks like, and the reason why it's very persistent, or can be very persistent in a grazing system, is it runs on stolons. So these, the sort of horizontal growth habit means it sort of hugs the soil, and so if an animal comes and steps on it, it basically becomes two plants, and both plants keep going. There's a sort of, you can see this sort of imaginary root system here. So if an animal comes here and steps on it, or there's some damage that happens here, this bit continues growing and this bit continues growing. So that's how it maintains some of its persistency within grazing systems. The only challenge is that we've then got, and James alluded to different varieties, so we've got them by small, medium and large. Medium is probably the most flexible in terms of it can suit with quite a lot of systems. You wouldn't use, for example, you'd rarely use any small in a dairy-based system, and conversely, you wouldn't use very much large leaf white clover in a sheep system. So it's worth considering what's your objective for that field, what's going to graze it, how do I need to choose the right variety of clover to match that objective. This is some work from Ireland in terms of when growth patterns are occurring, and this is grass versus white clover, and just showing that white clover is a lot of its activity is happening later in the season. So we just need to be careful in terms of our expectation of how much is really going to appear in the spring. The advantage of this is when you've got dry bits or dry areas, is it's providing dry matter production in what could be a lower area for grass, and that's why it's useful in particularly dry places. It helps to sort of spread grass and forage production across the year quite successfully. This just really quickly just highlights that clover also has preferences for grass types. It particularly does not like growing with cocksfoot. It's probably to do with how cocksfoot is quite aggressive and sort of tries to prevent plants from growing anywhere near it. What it really likes is timothy. So again, that timothy is used quite a lot in some beef and sheep systems. So it's also thinking of how we can match it with certain grasses. Like you can see, the ryegrass here is sort of middle table, while it particularly likes timothy and not the biggest fan of cocksfoot. So it's just something else to ponder in terms of explaining why white clover isn't quite where you need it to be. So the bit that we need to focus on is we've talked about the top bits, but the bottom bits, which is the best ways we can kill white clover out of swards are overgrazing in the winter. And this is not about we graze it tight and then we rest it for 3 months and then we might graze it again in the spring. This is about nearly continuous sheep grazing throughout the entire winter. And what that does is, we talked about the stolons can sort of maintain, they can split and you can have two plants. But obviously if that's happening constantly over that wet winter and the soils aren't warm enough for that plant to keep sort of regenerating itself, you will get plant loss. And sort of and also undergrazing in the spring and summer. And that's to do, as James mentioned, it's to do with, I'll just go back, the leaf emergence here. So the leaf, to trigger this leaf to appear from this stolon, it needs light to get to that stolon. So if you've got a lot of grass cover, that light isn't getting to the base of that sward, and so it's not triggering this production of leaves. And that's why it's important that we don't allow this really high cover in the spring to allow the clover to get swamped out. And some of that, we sort of link it to nitrogen use as well. So nitrogen use in the spring is driving grass growth, and it's also affecting how clover's dealing with being swamped out, basically. So red clover, very different plant, so grows off a taproot. Its growing crown sits about 5 centimetres above the ground, so if you damage that crown by sheep grazing it or a foot landing on it, and in wet times that plant will die. So we don't tend to get any more, we don't get any more red clover plants in a field. It's how quickly they decline is the bit that we're managing. But yeah, generally drilled alongside ryegrass, perennial ryegrass or hybrids. In a silage system, we're generally looking at a 3 to 4 year rotation on that. We need a 5-year break before it's put back into that field. So we just have to think about where it's going next after it's had that time in red clover. In terms of lamb performance, cattle performance, some of the biggest growth rates are on red clover. So we tend to put red clover at the top in terms of what's driving live weight gain. We might have a plantain, chicory, diverse sward after that. We might have lucerne after that, and then we've got grass at the bottom. So it always, whenever there's any work on lamb growth rates or cattle growth rates, anything with red clover generally has a higher growth rate and speed of finish because it contains this phytoestrogen. It encourages animals to lay down fat, so you tend to get animals finishing quicker as well on it. So that's why it has its impact, or how it has some of its impact. If you're interested in just having a bit more of a read about this trial, so if you Google or look at mating sheep on red clover swards field lab, if you just Google that, it'll come up with the report for this project, which is trying to sort of say that actually we can top sheep on red clover or swards that contain anywhere between 15 to 30% red clover without having any increase in barren rate. I still think I would be nervous about suggesting sheep on higher levels until we've done a bit more work. But in reality, in my bit of the world, this topping, if people were topping for sort of Feb, late Jan lambing, there was nothing else on that farm than red clover. So we'll see soon enough whether it does work. So yeah, I think it's sort of, for a lot of us, it's sort of reduced the risks associated with red clover and ewe fertility. So this is just a couple of examples of what we would do. So suckler cows generally are not going to be on your precious white and red clover swards. They might do a tidying up job every now and again, but it's too valuable to probably be going towards a suckler cow system. We might be putting thinner cows on better silage during the winter to sort of build up condition, but generally it's going to be prioritised to your growing cattle and some of your finishing cattle. I know a farmer who is replacing some of his concentrates used for finishing bulls with red clover silage. So he hasn't replaced all of them, but has replaced a fair amount of concentrates with putting in some red clover and grass silage, sorry. So again, we're trying to get them, particularly these animals, onto grass with some clover, so they naturally transition themselves. So as the clover starts coming up, they're starting to sort of be exposed to more of it, and it's allowing them to transition onto these grass clover lays. We can definitely set up the worst possible circumstance for bloat, which is putting an animal out of a shed that's a bit hungry into a field with lots and lots of clover. We can guarantee those animals, not quite guarantee, but if we want to set up a bloat condition, that's how to do it. So it's allowing those animals to transition as the clover levels increase on those swards. And then there's during that autumn, the clover levels may be dropping a bit, so just checking in terms of performance there. Sheep systems, really interesting opportunities for triplets or young sheep to be lambed on these sort of high clover swards, particularly red clover. Again, prioritising sheep with lambs. We could be then shutting up we could graze them initially and then shut them up for some silage with some aftermath grazing for wean lambs later on red clover. And then dry ewes again won't be on it for very much, but could be used quite effectively they could be used to tidy up fields and sort of build up conditions. And then we could be moving them we could have options in the winter, so they could be on a vetch-based cover crop. They could be being fed red clover, as I mentioned. But generally we're trying wherever possible to not overgraze those clover-based swards in the winter. And the challenge is when we're starting to push up the amount of clover on all farms is our ability to have any area that hasn't got clover over the winter is getting more and more limited. But as I mentioned, it's not about no grazing, it is about continuous set stocking of these areas that we're trying to avoid. So if you graze an area, shut it off and move on to another one is the key. So, from my perspective, they need to play, and on some farms they already are, but they need to play an important role on every beef and sheep system. They do make management more challenging, but I think it's quite an interesting challenge, and sort of alluded to the amount of difference we can make in terms of margins. It's a challenge we all need to sort of accept. But yeah, we have to think about what the plant likes. We can't just treat it like grass. We have to think slightly differently about what that plant needs at certain times of the year. And then, as mentioned, these more specialist legumes have a place, but how do they fit into your system? Does it fit with your requirements? But there's a lot, as you could see, there was a lot of choice to choose from in terms of where you can go next. But let's perhaps concentrate on white and red clover, and then let's get fancier once we've sorted them out. Thank you.
Thank you, Liz, for that run through, comprehensive run through. Can I now invite? Sorry, the wrong way. Keep going. Can I now invite James back up to the platform along with David Patterson and Liz? Just to introduce David quickly to you. David graduated from Queen's University with a degree in agriculture and obtained a PhD in grass grower sward dynamics. He then worked at Queen's as a turf grass breeder at Gaul before taking up a grassland technologist post at Greenmount. After working various roles within Danny, Dart and finally Dira, he finally came back to grass in January 2018 to take up his current post as grassland agronomist at Affby Hillsborough. So I'm going to open it up to the floor very shortly for questions. There's Sarah and Courtney at the back there. Put your hand up for a question. But maybe just to start off with, maybe just ask the panelists, what are the key differences in managing? So say we've successfully now established our high clover swards. What's the key differences in managing those properly to maintain them and get the value out of them, as opposed to your traditional perennial ryegrass and high nitrogen, high manufactured nitrogen swards? James, do you want to make a comment from a dairy perspective?
Mike? Yeah.
Yep.
Okay, so I think I'll just try to work through the year. The way we kind of do it now, say grass-only swards, close up with a cover of around 700. Going out in February, covers of 1,100. With the clover system, we wanted substantially lower than that. And I mentioned Scott Laidlaw's work earlier on, but I forgot to mention, of course, that was David was working on that as well at the time. So a low winter cover, no nitrogen fertilizer then as we go into the spring. And you say, how can that work? How can you have a system running on no nitrogen fertilizer and a low winter cover? How do you have grass in the spring? But as I said, we've been running it now for 5 years, and you know, we're not seeing a problem from that point of view. Much more focus on tight grazing as we go through the growing season. And then we tend to allow our rotations to get longer. And I think that's more important with a clover system from August onwards. And Liz showed the picture there of the clover stolon. You know, it's like ivy that grows along the wall. We'll see a substantial increase in the amount of stolon we have at the base of the sward over the course of the growing season. It can often double. Of course, that's very important. You know, that has a big impact on your clover content. And as I said earlier on, we could lose half of that stolon over the winter if we're not careful. So winter management is absolutely crucial.
Thank you.
And that would be about it. The differences are small enough other than that.
Is there any comments?
No, similar in terms of, for me, well, I alluded to it multiple times, but that avoiding overgrazing, this continuous grazing in the winter for that point in terms of stolon death. But in terms of spring, it's very similar to sward heights and pasture cover targets you would be for grazing systems. Potentially with probably a little bit more focus on residual height, so making sure that grass is low enough for the clover to be then stimulated to grow again.
David, anything you want to add?
Is this on? Well, Since James politely reintroduced me into that piece of work that was the late 80s, would you believe? Couldn't emphasise enough that point about the winter grazing. And if I think maybe on beef and sheep farms, there's a great opportunity, especially with the sheep, to do what I call a short, sharp graze. So it's a lot of mouths on the sward for a short spell of time. And that particular piece of work that Scott Laidlaw and I worked on, that was the best timing of that was in around that Halloween period. Late October, maybe into early November. Depends a lot on the ground conditions and the rainfall at the particular time, but a short, sharp graze. And in terms of what our measurements were at that time, what we found was that the plots that were successfully grazed off to that close grazing height in the autumn period had a higher growing point density on the clover plants. You saw the clover stolons in the photographs. Each one of those gets to a terminal point, and that terminal point, or growing point as we refer to it, the higher density of those per square metre or square yard that you have in the late autumn, early winter dictates the amount of production you will have in the spring. Now, the other folks maybe will refer to it, but one sort of system type challenge with white clover reliance, for relying on white clover systems, is the spring gap. And I think Liz's growth chart showed it. There's a later take-off of growth of clover in the spring. So one way of trying to accommodate that a wee bit, or deal with that, is have this short, sharp graze in the autumn, boost the spring productivity of clover by having a tighter, denser population of plants surviving the winter. Because if you don't get your clover to survive winter to winter, you don't have anything to work with. So it's critical.
Okay, questions from the floor then? Yeah, one down here. I'll just wait till I get the microphone to you.
You've sort of said about why we need clover. You could maybe go a bit more on how to grow it, particularly in the silage applications of red clover silage. You know, the 2-cut system, 3-cut system, when's the best time to cut, etc.
I'll do it. So in terms of red clover, generally depends a bit that you'd be aiming for a 3-cut and then some aftermath grazing. Depends on, you can do 2 cuts and more aftermath grazing. The cuts is very dependent on how it's been grazed in the winter in terms of how much grass is there. But most you might cut it slightly later than a grass first cut, but it wouldn't be far behind. And what tends to happen in that first cut is you get a greater proportion of grass to clover. Second cut, you get more clover to grass, and by the third cut, it's mainly clover that you're cutting. So the other thing to think about is how you, if you're going to put it into bales, how you manage those bales, because they have very different properties. So I mentioned the guy who is using it within his finishing bull system, and he would be targeting that cut 2 and 3 going into that system, and the first cut wouldn't be good enough for that. So, but where it fits really well in beef and sheep systems is that silage is being used to feed cattle, beef cattle, growing cattle, maybe some sheep, and then the aftermath grazing is being used to finish lambs, and it does it very well.
You said there was silage you could have in the sward for 5 years, and after that give it for a 5-year rest. Why is that?
So the question was about why do you need a 5-year rest in red clover? It's to do with disease build-up. So there's both a sort of fungal infection and also a pest that can affect it. So it's trying to ensure that you don't get a build-up of that disease and pest in that sward. And that 5 years is deemed enough to reduce that risk. So it's not the same, but it's a bit like trying to avoid brassicas in the same field. It's that sort of idea. We're just trying to give a break to that sward. And what you can do is establish a sward that is red clover, white clover grass, and as that red clover dies out, you're left with a white clover grass-based sward, which then lasts 5 years, and it gives you sometimes enough of a break from red clover to then start it again. But I would, depending on your circumstance, would also harvest some of that nitrogen maybe through a whole crop or a cereal crop if necessary.
James, I know you've been looking at red clover silage and those kind of longer term mixes. Do you want to comment on your practice?
So we're working on the same principle that as the red clover dies out over time, that we'll then be left with a white clover sward. There's a huge amount of interest in red clover and silage ground on outblocks, you know, where farms are fragmented and you make silage on the outblock, partly because you can grow the red clover on the outblock with no nitrogen fertiliser, and then you can continue with nitrogen fertiliser on the home block. That's the way our dairy farmers are thinking. So in terms of establishment, I think an April establishment is best. Burn it off with Roundup. We'll do, I think April is a good time to put it in. It might be ideal. You might like to get off the first cut, but what we'll do, burn off within a week, cultivate. We use the disc, 2 runs of a disc, 2 runs of a power harrow. We put in a seed mixture, red clover seed mixture, 4 kilos of red clover, 8 kilos of perennial ryegrass. We're actually using a mix of 4 kilos of perennial ryegrass, 4 kilos of hybrid ryegrass, and we put in a kilo of white clover as well. Roll it, spray it after 6 weeks with Clover Safe Spray, Clover Max, DB Plus are the trade names we'd be dealing with. And if we put in an April reseed, you're talking about take your first cut in July, middle of July, second cut in end of September, end of August in our case. Very wary of making silage after the end of August, first week of September, so we take a zero grazing then. You could get around 2 tons of zero grazing in November, or you could graze it, depending on how you're set up. The next year then, we'll zero graze it again in the spring because we have, that's in March. First cut then is recommended around the 20th of May, similar to and certainly not allowing the first cut to go into July. And then, like the reseed, second cut middle of July, third cut end of August, zero grazing. That's how we're managing it as we speak.
David, anything you want to add on the red clover silage?
Just a quick comment. AFB trial from a few years ago now, I think it was 2014 published, but essentially it was monocultures, be it from straight grass right the way through to straight pure red clover, fed with slurry only, so 4 cuts taken, and even after I think it was the 4th harvest year, the red clover was still there in the pure stand and had out-yielded the Italian ryegrass, the perennial ryegrass, pure sown stands. So tremendous productivity there. We can get into the subject of quality and how to make silage and all of that, but purely and simply in terms of yieldability, even after 4 years, there was still 70% of the red clover stand as pure red clover. There was some ingress of grass weeds, of course, but tremendous productivity over 4 years.
Just come back in there again because the other thing is absolutely crucially important is potassium fertilisation. So for every ton of dry matter we expect to take off, we put on 25 kilos of K and 3 kilos of P. So for first cut in late May, take off maybe 5 tons of dry matter per hectare. We put on 125 kilos of K, 3 kilos of P in anticipation of that. I think it's absolutely vital for the longevity of the crop, because organic farmers come in and talk to us and they say, well, we put in red clover silage, it didn't last 3 years. I think it's all down to paying very close attention to your P and K fertilisation. It's a very hungry crop, huge demand for fertilizer.
If I could ask James, just in terms of people making that first step in preparing and even thinking ahead to next spring, it's not that far away now. We've mentioned pH and the importance of that, and you've mentioned, and so has Liz, the importance of P and K follow-ups, whether it's silage or grazing. What about getting the land clean and the soil clean well ahead of that? You mentioned the post-emergent spray, but there's a lot of docks in our grassland up here. Any comments on how to prepare to get a good clean stand?
There's a lot of docks everywhere. No, I think I wouldn't complicate that. I think I'd put on lime. If the ground dried up now, it's an ideal condition. It looks like we're in for a couple of dry weeks, so I put on lime now. Even now. And in terms of the docks, I think Roundup, glyphosate type product next, in advance of the crop. If you're very worried about it, as I said, we tried to turn it around within a week between burning off and reseeding. But if you were very worried about it, go in with the Roundup, leave it 2 weeks, 3 weeks, and if you think it's not after getting a good kill, just go back in with another round of Roundup. And you'll surely have it killed at that stage. That's the best way of getting rid of docks. I did his PhD on Clover, I did mine on docks. So we've done a lot of that around the same time. But like we did a study recently, and what we did was we put in reseed 2010. We put on we divided the field into 9 sections. First section we gave it no post-emergence herbicide, no treatment. Next 4 sections got 4 different post-emergence herbicides. And then we waited 2 years until 2012, and we put on Dockstar, Forefront, Eagle and Prospect, 4 different. So you get what we were trying to do. We were trying to look at controlling using post-emergence herbicides, and where we were using mature dock herbicides, as we call them. I guess you'd the same. And the very interesting thing about the study is, so we studied the docks in over 6 years. So initially, 2010, you could see no docks in the field in the reseed. 2011, 2012, you'd say the field was free of docks, no hassle. But we were going out counting the docks, so we knew the docks were there, you just couldn't see them. And the real transition then happened between 2012 2013, which is about year 4 into the study. Between year 3 and year 4, next thing the docks started becoming very apparent. And by 2016, which was the end of the study, the docks had more or less completely dominated where we'd put on no herbicide. Where we put on the Forefront and the Dockstar, which are not Clover safe, so, but it wasn't a Clover study. Where we put on the Forefront and the Dockstar, we got around a 50% kill, but then the docks multiplied back up. Where we put on Eagle, we got an initial burn off, and then we had as many docks after 3 months as before we put on the Eagle, how you could say. And then the Prospect likewise, we got a very poor kill, and then of course they just multiplied up. But the real lesson for me, and it was very, very clear, where we put on the post-emergence herbicides day 1 after reseeding, those, we got a 95% kill day 1 with half the herbicide, and that paddock, those plots remained perfectly clean right throughout the study. Like, I mean, where we didn't spray, it was an absolute disgrace. We were more or less told to get out of the field because it looked absolutely terrible, but where we killed the docks with the post-emergence herbicide, and if we apply that to a clover sward, you've one real opportunity to control docks, and that's during reseeding. It's a window, it's a very small window, maybe some point between 6 and 8 weeks after reseeding. You have a small window to put on your post-emergence herbicide. I'd say under no circumstances miss it. And I'd often meet groups of farmers in the farm and said, I couldn't see any docks. So they'd be fine, there'd be no problem. And I said, wait 3-4 years. You know, really, whatever you do, if you're putting in clover, put on post-emergence herbicide.
Okay, David over here.
Do we have a post-emergence herbicide license in North Ireland for currently present? Was Clover safe? So I knew, because the last time I was asked, I had a reseed in the autumn and went into the medical merchant and was told there's no such thing currently available in Northern Ireland. Maybe that's not correct, but certainly there's an issue with post-emergence dot control. And just want to have the microphone, just a couple other questions I want to maybe put to James as well. You need to comment on the bloat issue, what you're doing about bloat on your farm, because that's a real put off for a lot of farmers. Is the concern about bloat, lose 1 or 2 animals, freight clover, and also what you said about P&K, the cost of that. I just wondered, thinking to myself, if I've red clover sward and I have to go and try and source P and K fertiliser, I may just think I'll just put on some 20-10-10 and forget about the red clover. You know, so those are practical issues, James. So sorry for 3
No,
questions.
on the herbicide one, David, I would have to go back and check. I'm not quite sure at this point in time. Go back to you on that.
I could get myself in trouble now, but in terms of if you take Eagle, like we're very restricted in terms of what post-emergence herbicide we're allowed to use. But an interesting thing about Eagle is it's licensed for use on reseeds in the UK. It's not licensed for that use in Ireland. And what you could use Eagle at a half rate as a post-emergence herbicide if that works fine. And I guess it's really available. So
Is that MCPA? Sorry, Jim, is that MCPA or something?
it's 2,4-D based, but the exact Eagle, I don't know about Eagle, but the other ones, the Clover Max and the DB Plus are based on 2. I think there's MCPA in those as well, yeah. But yeah, Eagle is an option. That's more the bloat question. The thing about bloat is we've around 130 cows on the farm in Salahead. We've clover on the farm for the last 23 years. We've lost 3 cows with bloat in that time. So the thing about it is, if a farmer is trying clover, loses a cow with bloat, or maybe loses a few cows with bloat, that is an absolute killer. But in terms of putting people off, the key to managing it is like when Liz showed a picture there of a sward that was 60% clover, it is still only 60%, even though it looks like it's 100% clover, because when you look at how clover grows, it's a bit like an umbrella. The clover leaves sit on the surface of the sward, and then you have the stem growing down into the ground. And if you take the grass tends, during the summer, tends to be beneath the clover. And the key to that, the really worst case scenario in terms of bloat is if you have cows, you skin out the sward that they were in, say the strip, you move them into the next paddock, they're starving, hungry, go in, they whip off all the clover leaf sitting on the surface. And that's really a real trigger for bloat. So one of the measures our farmers take is, say if they're leaving cows in the first place, there are a number of steps you can take around that. One is, if you're say on a 4-day break or 4 grazing break, 2-day break, with the cows in the paddock here, you go moving them here, don't take 4 grazings off and take 3 grazings, so they're not hungry, go on to the next paddock. Let the cows in, let them graze off the top of the sward, put them back in then and graze out where they were. Does that make sense? The other thing is put up a grazing strip. Say when you're leaving them in first, just put up enough for an hour, 2 hours, force them to graze down into the base of the sward before you leave them off over the rest of the sward, just to take the edge off their hunger. Do you understand what I mean? So if you put them in the field for the first time, like we've used bloat oil, I think it's expensive and it's not particularly useful because the kind of conditions that are conducive to bloat are often conditions where cows aren't drinking a lot of water anyway. And it's particularly expensive this year, but it's something you can use. But I think management is a better option. Where we're finding the biggest problems with bloat is in late September, October. You know, when grass is running tight at that time of the year. So what we've been doing is supplementing with silage, 2 kilos of silage into the diet, and that breaks up any risk of bloat. The one thing I'll say about bloat is you'll never get it when you expect it.
Potassium, P and K fertiliser, yes.
Well, okay. So I mentioned a lot of potassium there, and we're talking, you know, but a lot of that can come from slurry, you know, and that'll vary a lot from farm to farm. It'll vary with distance from, you know, if you carry slurry long distance or whatever, so that can influence the cost. Of course, costs have gone up, but that wouldn't put me off cost-wise.
Yes.
And no, just also in terms of whether you've got any P and K to mine from the soil. Do you mean so the indices will depend, or you're suggesting that's got to be readily available K? Or would,
Well, I think the thing with outblocks in particular is generally you very little, those soils are generally very low in P and K, and if you're harvesting off crops of silage, like in our case 3 cuts of silage and 0 grazing, you mine out all of that K very quickly. And the one thing I'd say about that is, like I said, put on 25 kilos per tonne of dry matter. It's important to put that on before every crop, and not to try to put all the K on at once, because what will happen, you get luxury uptake, you get huge amounts of K taken off in the first crop, cause problems with milk fever then later on. So balanced fertilisation. Now, like David asked a question earlier on, if you're setting up for next year in an outblock, working on the assumption that the lime is low, P and K are low, put on the lime now, and I just fertilise the crop from there on out. I wouldn't consider the indices really at all, just put on enough K to grow the crop, enough P and K to grow the crop.
Liz, any points you want to make on bloat?
no, it's a similar point in terms of, particularly with or people starting to graze red clover with cattle, they'd go, the sward height would go higher, so the grass is more mature. So it's adding some fibre into that diet, or you can try a ring feeder with hay, but they generally don't go for it. But one way of doing it is basically pushing the sward height up a bit higher. But yeah, it's hungry animals gorging themselves, all of those factors. But
Okay. All right, any more questions? Just hold on a second.
The type of perennial then, is that what is going breeding, you said, is it going to be the more open perennials? You know, the earlier varieties, are they going to, and what you're saying about bloat there, if you have the earlier perennials, it might be inclined to more stem to sort of counteract to the bloat, plus the more open sward of the earlier perennials, will that encourage the more clover?
It does, and I think Liz showed that as well, where the tetraploids were better than the diploids from that point of view. The wood here, so open is better,
Yeah.
and the other thing I'd add to that is a variety that you can really graze out. So in the pasture profit index that we have developed in Chagas, there's this utilization index, and I tend to look at that, varieties that cows will naturally graze out better than other varieties.
But yeah, and I suppose back to that point of how do we try and reduce it, is we're trying to get a bit more lignin into their diets, aren't we? So it could be that you've got a bit more seed head, it could be that you're putting in additional forage, but it is just trying to help to slow that the throughput through that rumen.
I would avoid the early. Yeah. Open, yes. Good graze out, yes. Good seasonal shoulder growth, spring and autumn, but avoid the early heading grass, because you probably will have more of a problem with fighting and controlling stem mid-season. Why make life hard for yourself? And the clover doesn't like it that well.
And just, sorry, I forgot to add, sometimes with grazing red clover with wean lambs, we get some red gut, which is clostridial driven, and so it's also important to ensure they're on a clostridial vaccination program. It's not going to completely avoid the problem, but it tries to reduce the risk a bit.
Any more questions? Yep, go ahead.
Just taking in what has been said about red clover, is there a need for longer lasting layers, 5-6 years, to avoid having to reseed them so often, or is there varieties in the pipeline already that last longer? And the second thing was, Liz, you'd mentioned, I think it was subterranean clover in Southern Hemisphere, if you could maybe give us a wee bit more detail on it.
So the first one, there is germinal produced 2 varieties called Aber Chianti that were meant to be going for a 4 or 5 year sort of persistency. So that there are varieties out there which have been selected for persistency, but what you also see is they tend to be lower yielding in year 1 compared to shorter lived ones. It's always a bit of a trade-off. So subterranean, they use it quite a lot in dry land places, but but it doesn't really withstand the dry, which I always find interesting. But what it does is help during the winter, so that although it's their winter, it's still not particularly cold, and that's when it tends to grow the best. And it really hugs the soil, so it still grows along sort of a stolon type system, but you don't get very much damage because it's not actually sort of above the soil to be damaged, and that's where it gets some of its persistency from. But you'll see quite a lot of work growing subterranean with fescues, and that's driving quite a lot of live weight gain in very dry places. So we've sort of played around or thought about bringing or trying some over here and haven't got to it yet, but it's now we've experienced the year that we have back home, we're probably going to try some and see how we get on. But I think we just have to look at persistency in this country when we do get rain.
Yeah, go ahead. Over there.
What about the problem was rain overall? We see the Clover on YouTube it on.
Sorry, can you just repeat that again?
Rain.
Rain, yeah.
And cold weather.
So so the point in terms of it doesn't do well in wet soils or wet conditions, is that the point? Or it still likes it will still respond to moisture, as most plants don't like their feet being wet. The risk with grazing it in wet conditions is that you more likely to damage it, and the red clover is more prone to being killed out at that point. So it's more to do with how we manage them during a wet time and trying to avoid grazing them if possible, just to reduce the risk.
But our summer is wet all the time.
Yeah, and what we're looking for in that circumstance is a plant that is actively growing to move soil from soil through. Do you mean it's moving water through it? So the way to dry soils out is to get an active is to be growing something above it, and that at certain times of the year is as the grass's growth rate is starting to shut down. Clover has a role in moving water out of those soils. But if it's very, very wet, it's going to affect all plant growth.
James, your wet soils?
Yeah, and I think if you take the last few years where we've had, we'd normally say we get a kind of a dry year, droughty year, 1 year in 11, but if you go back 1 year out of 11, if you go back over the last 5 years, 17, 18, 19, 20, 21, 22 this year, we've had relatively dry summers. And really, my results are based on that, and I'm a bit concerned about that because some of the earlier work, as I said, back in 2012, remember 2012, I don't know what it was like here, but for us, we got extremely wet conditions right throughout the summer. We had ponding, surface ponding right throughout the summer. Nothing does well under those circumstances. So fertilizer grass system or a clover system, but clover I think suffers proportionately more, white clover in particular, under those conditions. So if you were on a farm like that with surface ponding during the summer, I'd be much more wary about clover under those circumstances. What we find is if we get a really good year for clovers where you have intermittent wet and dry conditions, where you get a dry spell maybe for a couple of weeks of hot, dry weather, that really drives on the fixation to the next level. And, where you get dry weather without getting drought, if you understand what I mean. So where you get this good mix of really hot, dry weather and then wet week, that rather than this constant, like we got in 2012, like we got in 2009, the ground never really got a chance to dry out during the summer. And they're bad years for clover, there's no two ways about it. But they're bad years anyway, so whether you go into clover or not, that's the question. But in our case, with the farm that we had, and back in 2012, there was parts of the farm we couldn't get into. We've done a lot of drainage since then, and it's money well spent. But that's another topic, I guess.
I would just say that the sort of summer you've had west of the Ban this last 2 years have been better for clover. You haven't had the extremes of rain that you've had on previous summers. Last 2 summers, last 3 in fact, there's been a significant dry spell east of the Ban. Can't do much about that one. But you just will get a slightly later take-off of your clover in the springtime. But you can accommodate that to some extent. It doesn't fix it, it doesn't make it go away, but you can accommodate that to some extent by how you've managed it the previous autumn. Yeah, and it's about managing that and trying to carry some of that productivity over into the spring rotation. That's all you can do.
Okay. Any other questions? Yep, something there.
I just following on there something Liz has said, from some David mentioned there about the lack of Clover safe products or sprays. Sorry, I think just off the head, it's Square Ultra and Triad were the two. I think were the two licensed ones, and I think maybe Triad's off the market now. But that is an issue we have here. So for some farmers say, well, I've no sprays, it's not going to work. Could you just maybe elaborate, Liz, on the overseeding? You know, like a fair bit of autumn reseeds, you know, July, August up here. If you decide to just go in pure grass, when would you be coming in with your clover? What would be the practice, or what would you recommend next year?
So the dream is into warm but moist soils. So generally we're looking, it might be after a second cut, it might be after a later first cut. So when we've taken off a cut of grass and the grass is slightly shocked by this, the soils are warm but there's moisture, and that's when you start thinking about overseeding, and that's the sort of 1.5, 2.5 kilo type levels per acre. And so it's a scratching. Do you mean we have to have ensured we would have already obviously established we've got the right lime P and K because we've just done a reseed, and then it's a scratching in. So it's an Einbach type kit. It's you're literally just trying to tickle it into the surface. If it's a relatively new reseed, you've probably still got openish swards to do that in. The challenge becomes when we try and overseed it into a really established swards, we sometimes have to harrow it until we can probably see 40% soil. So it looks like we've nearly killed it. And then when we introduce white clover seed into it, we allow it to sort of settle, and then we're trying to bring hopefully, the best animals for it is sheep, to bring them back in after about 2 weeks, let them lightly graze it for a couple of days and get them out again, and do the same every couple of weeks until you're more confident that clover has started to take. You're trying to get them to eat the grass that's already established without taking out the new clover seedlings.
And what about any fertiliser, like obviously zero in?
So just you're trying to do everything possible not to stimulate the established grass. So no fertiliser at that point.
I'll take one final question if there is one. Yeah, do here, Wilfred.
Just to come back to the net zero problem, I gather that use of clover, it doesn't entirely eliminate the production of nitrous oxide. How does it actually compare? How does a clover system compare with a fertilised system in relation to the emissions?
So the way we look at that question, and you have to break it down into components. The first thing is when you put on the fertiliser, you put on, suppose we put on a bag of urea, for argument's sake, per acre. So you're putting on the equivalent of around 60 kilos of nitrogen per hectare. You're putting that all in one go, and it'll be taken up at a rate of 1 or 2 kilos per hectare per day over the next 6 weeks, for argument's sake. So there's a huge amount of nitrogen sitting in the soil under those circumstances. That's available for loss. With the clover system, you really don't have a lot of nitrogen sitting in the soil. It's more or less a just-in-time supply pattern. Does that make sense? Like the clover is fixing nitrogen all day, every day. It's making it available in the soil. And where we've made measurements where the comparison we make is where we've grass only with no fertilizer, no clover, no slurry, nothing. And then we've a grass clover sward. And we look at the difference in nitrous oxide emissions. And then next to that, we have a grass sward getting nitrogen fertilizer. So we look at the difference between those. Where we have a grass sward with no nitrogen and a grass clover sward side by side, we get the exact same emissions. So there is a background rate of emissions, but there's no difference in emissions. So our conclusion from that, and we've done a number of studies, we've been looking at this since 2008, is that there's no emissions from that part of the system. Now, if you take the next step, you say you grow the grass clover. We're growing 15 tons of grass clover, we're growing 15 tons of grass nitrogen, so it's a highly productive system both ways. Some people say it's a low nitrogen system, but it's not. Our clover system is actually a very high nitrogen system. As soon as you introduce that into the diet of the cow, she produces milk, she produces dung and urine. The emissions that we get at that end of the business, from the urine, is the same as from the high nitrogen system. So the real benefit we're getting is in the first step and not in the second step. There's no difference. When we look at the emissions from the slurry as well, it's the same. There's no difference.
Okay.
I suppose what you're avoiding is the high energy requirement needed to produce that urea or CAN or whatever onto farm. That's how the emissions are being reduced.
Okay, one last question here, and then we'll
You see, just with the red clover, have you had any issues in the last 20 odd years with it selling, especially towards third cut when it's mostly red clover in your store?
So the question is, any issues in terms of when you get to quite high levels of red clover in a silage? The biggest challenge is wilting. So to get it wilted, we should have said earlier is you're trying to take it to a slightly higher stubble height than you would a grass silage situation. So sort of anywhere between 6 to 8 centimetre stubble height, which not only tries to protect the growing point, but also acts as a bit of it holds it off the grass to try and get a bit more wilting. The idea, because of how fragile that clover leaf becomes, is to not move it. You might move it once at the beginning, so spread it out if you can, and then not touch it again until you start to put it. But you're aiming for a 24, hopefully 48-hour wilt. The books say do not use a conditioner. I know people who are using a conditioner, it's fine. But the general advice says not to use a conditioner. And but yeah, it's a longer wilting time is required, and there is a risk of it being slightly lower dry matter. But and some would, depending on grass levels, potentially using inoculant. When your grass levels are dropping, it might be useful to put some inoculant on it.
Okay, listen, everyone, thank you very, very much. I'm going to draw the evening to a close because the night's wearing on. I'd like to express my sincere thanks to James Humphreys and Liz Jennifer and David Patterson for joining us tonight, particularly for James, who's just had a long drive to come up here and heading back to another meeting tomorrow morning in December. That's not the easiest thing to do, so we really appreciate him coming up. Liz is over here for a couple of days with us doing some workshops, and I've worked with her for many years, and I've seen her value, and hopefully you've seen that tonight. And also David for joining us here tonight to provide some of those more local perspectives. So all I can do is to invite you for a cup of tea here or coffee to finish off, and wish you all a safe journey home. Thank you very much.